Grand strategy is why you are here. Grand strategy are the larger objectives that are important to you in your career, to your country, to you personally. Students at Yale have grand strategies. These relate, of course, to what they wish to do in life, to their ambitions, to navigating the Yale curriculum. Often for them, falling in love is a grand strategy, and so we get papers on how to do that or how to fall out of love gracefully. All of these things, in one way or another, are grand strategies. Grand really just means, is it important to you? And is it important to the people that you work with and to the people that you work for? So that's a very broad definition. Grand strategy is often associated with, in some way or another, military affairs, military history. And there is a reason for that. Because if you think of grand strategy as the calculated relationship of ends, of means to large ends, if you think about it as the question of how do you get from where you are to where you want to go, if you think about it in terms of organizing large operations, large systems, complex networks, the kinds of things that you have to worry about in your own country. And then if you think about where would you go to find textbooks on that subject? Where would you go to find principles for how to do that? Where would you go to pull together much of the best that has been written and thought about this subject, not just for the last 25 years, but perhaps for the last 2,500 years? You might well go to the great classical works of grand strategy, like Sun Tzu, for example, within the Chinese tradition, or Thucydides on the Peloponnesian War, or Clausewitz, or Metternich, for example. And it's not that we are interested in these texts because they teach you how to fight wars. It's because the exercise of fighting wars is one of the oldest of human activities. And it may well be the oldest organized human activity. So people and states have spent more time over more centuries thinking about that in the context of war than in any other context that has come down to us by way of written texts. That does not mean, however, that the study of grand strategy today, or even that the study of grand strategy then, was always a blueprint for fighting wars. So if you read a text like Thucydides on the Peloponnesian Wars, as we do as one of the introductory texts in our class, you find it is not only a commentary on this great war between the Athenians and the Spartans 2,500 years ago, but you find that it is a profound commentary on human nature. It is a profound commentary on the way in which states organize themselves, the way in which states destroy themselves. And it is still read fruitfully for those purposes, despite the fact that the military technology discussed in that ancient text is now profoundly out of date. Hardly anybody employs hoplites anymore, or triremes anymore, to engage in military affairs. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we in the grand strategy class call transferability, to take principles extracted from one different time and place and culture and see if they are transferable. And that really is how we like to think about grand strategy generally. We like to think about principles that cross time and space and cultures. We like to think about principles that are timeless in the sense that they have been around for a long time and are not bound by any particular place or period. But at the same time, principles that are timely in the sense that they are going to be of use to us, or they can be of use to us today. So timeless but timely is, I think, the definition of a classical work. That's why we read the classics in the first place, whether it's literature or whether it's poetry or whether it is the classics of grand strategy. And from that, we believe certain principles can be extracted that actually are useful in this time, which, like all other times, has a host of problems confronting it. But one of those problems we find in a university setting is the problem of how do we think. That's not a new problem. I'm sure people have had the problem of how to think throughout as long as people have been thinking. But at the moment, there is a division in the academic community, and to a considerable extent, I think it spills over into professional communities like you on how we think. One pole, one extreme, one end of this spectrum is what we might call anecdotalism. That is just telling stories, just accumulating cases, if you were a doctor, telling your own experiences, but not putting them into any kind of an order, just a kind of bare chronology or mindless recounting of what has happened with no attempt to draw lessons from it. You've all read history books that do this. You've all read boring history books where it's just one battle after another, or it's one state collapse after another, or it's one failed politician after another, but no lessons are extracted from it. You are left either to extract the lessons yourself or to put the book down because you find it so boring and useless. So that's one end of this intellectual spectrum, anecdotalism. But there is another end to this intellectual spectrum that is particularly evident these days in the modern social sciences here, but also elsewhere in this country and around the world. And this is the preoccupation with theory. Somehow the advent of computer technology, somehow the advent of the capability to crunch numbers much faster and much more effectively than was possible in the past has led to the illusion that everything can be reduced to numbers, that systems, complex systems, can be rendered in simple terms, or if not in simple terms, then in complex terms made simple by computers. And that through the accumulation of all of this statistical data and through the accumulation of the patterns that derive from it as they are explained to us by the computers, we can extract wisdom. Now, you've all seen and you've all had experience with theoretical models that do not connect with reality. That's one of the great tasks that anybody who is involved in practical affairs has got to think about, is how do you connect theory with reality? And I think increasingly it does not connect. Increasingly there is too big a gap between reality and theory, and that's the other end of this intellectual spectrum that I mentioned to you. It's the flip side. It's the polar opposite of the meaningless, mindless anecdotalism that's over here, and the tendency to reduce all of reality to a set of computer-driven models, which is over here. I think grand strategy is somewhere in between. At least that's where we try to put it. And I'd like to illustrate this by simply mentioning several fundamental principles of grand strategy as we teach them to our students. And our students range from sophomores up through postdoctoral fellows, so it's quite a diverse range of students. But this is what Betsy has been hearing as she has come into our seminar over the last year and a half or so. She's been very serious about this. These are just a few examples of things that are perfectly obvious when stated, but they have to be stated in order to become obvious. It's a paradox. Here's one. Recognize that ends are infinite, but means are never infinite. Hence the need to be precise about objectives. If you're talking about objectives, you can formulate objectives right and left until you turn blue. There can be an infinite number of objectives. You can make your objective pie in the sky, as we say in the States. or mini pods in the sky. But all of this has to be tethered to a certain reality about means. This is exactly what Betsy was saying about 15 minutes ago, standing up here. It's all very nice for Yale University to be sponsoring this conference, but even Yale University has got to think about the constraints that means impose on ends. And so that's perfectly basic. Things cost something. And yet, how often do we see people spinning off objectives without reference to costs or to means? It's the discipline of linking those two things that I think is inherent in grand strategy. And if you go back to the most ancient texts, which may well have to do with the movement of armies across landscapes, you will see the same thing. Because Thucydides, Sun Tzu, Pericles, Alcibiades, etc., these people faced that same problem then. So it's timeless, but at the same time it's timely. Another one is to recognize that ends and means are related to one another. You cannot compartmentalize them. They have an interconnected relationship. If you pick too ambitious an end, it can overstretch your means. And we all can think of examples of this. Think of the British Empire in its last days when it was greatly overstretched, thereby giving rise to Professor Kennedy's most famous term from his book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, imperial overstretch. Think of the United States and its periodic problem with overstretching its commitments. So if you do this, you can weaken yourself. If you project means too ambitiously, you can weaken yourself by, project ends too ambitiously, you can weaken yourself by overstretching means. But you can also corrupt ends by picking inappropriate means. Let's say you have some objective in mind, but let's say the means by which you seek to pursue that objective are so offensive or immoral or draconian or whatever it might be, it actually corrupts what you're trying to do. Think of the Bush administration's torture memos, for example, and think of the damage that did in proportion to what it actually achieved. It's going to be a textbook case in the importance of not letting the means you choose corrupt the ends that you have in mind. The third principle would be to recognize that perfection is never possible. We've all been told this in religion. Christianity has a concept of original sin, for example, which is making that point fairly firmly. But it's also a grand strategic principle. Perfection would be trying to do everything perfectly, and of course you exhaust yourself, you exhaust others by trying to do that. Perfection, it's often been said, is the enemy of the good, and the good is what we are all seeking, but the good is contingent. The good is going to be imperfect. The good is going to leave something left undone. Machiavelli had a wonderful sentence in The Prince in which he says, God does not wish to do everything. God leaves a few things to you. So even God leaves some things for us to do. So recognizing the limits of perfection, recognizing the importance of doing the best you can, but understanding at the same time that there are always going to be problems with the approach that you take is, I think, an important element of grand strategy. I have studied professionally and have written a book on the strategy of containment as articulated and implemented by the United States during the Cold War period. But one of the great periodic problems of containment was exactly what was it that we were trying to contain. If we went out and tried to contain one thing, like the Soviet Union, then there would be concerns about all kinds of other things that were developing, as in the early period, for example, the People's Republic of China, or later on Ho Chi Minh, or later on the Iranian bullets. There was always somebody out there who was doing something that caused a focus on just the Soviet Union to seem dangerous somehow. So, okay, there were other American strategists who shifted around and said, we're going to deal with all of those threats out there. We're going to cover the waterfront in dealing with these dangers. And of course, what they ran into was exhaustion. Financial exhaustion, physical exhaustion, political exhaustion in terms of exhausting the domestic political tolerance of strategies like those that we were following, for example, in the Vietnam War. And so containment was an oscillation over 45 years between these two principles. And I think it would have been better if it could have been recognized early on that you cannot have all of that strategy and you cannot have all of this strategy, because there are problems anytime you do that. But that strategy is kind of a tight wire act. It's kind of a trapeze act. Strategy is a matter of balancing things. There are never solutions this way or the other way. It's the tension between the two, and it's the balance that you maintain, like walking a tightrope with a balancing pole. That comes much closer to what grand strategy actually is. Another principle is recognize that friction will happen. Or to put it another way, what can go wrong will go wrong. This is a universal principle. I know that it does not have to be explained to you. All of us confront it in life, but it's amazing how frequently in planning we fail to take it into account. And this is where the study of disasters in grand strategy actually can be very productive as case studies. Friction is always going to be there. And because it is going to be there, there's one other grand strategic principle that we teach, which is the value of seeking leverage. If your means are limited, if friction is going to be a problem, always, it becomes very important to look for those points of leverage at which you can apply a small amount of energy or a relatively small amount of energy and produce disproportionate effects, produce big effects. And that's getting very close to the center of what grand strategy is all about. Looking for points of leverage at which you can have the maximum results with the minimum investment of effort. There are many examples of this in history, although actually fewer examples than failures to do this. But one of the most famous examples from my field of American diplomatic history in the Cold War was General George Marshall's famous speech at Harvard University in June 1947, announcing the Marshall Plan. And this was a period when there was great fear that the Soviet Union was either going to take over Europe militarily, or more likely that the Europeans themselves, out of despair, would vote in communists who would then take orders from the Soviet Union. It's only 2 years after the war. And yet, with a single well-calculated, though not well-delivered speech, Marshall promised American assistance, promised something revolutionary. The idea that this country, previously throughout its history in peacetime always isolationist, would now become internationalist and would develop a sense of responsibility for the health of other societies. And simply the making of that one speech turned the whole momentum, at least in terms of the Cold War in Europe, around. That's the most famous example of leverage in, I think, the history of grand strategy. And that is why even today, you constantly hear people say, whenever some problem comes up, whether the problem is inadequate resources here, or the problem is mismanagement over here, or whether the problem is poverty here, or illness here, or whatever, everybody's first reaction is, we need a Marshall Plan for X, whatever X is. Well, you can't have a Marshall Plan for everything, but you could think about Marshall, and you could think about his own plan, and you could think about how it worked, and you could think about the tricks that he was using at that point, and it could be something to aspire to. Not necessarily something that you can achieve, but something to aspire to. So one of the things you guys are going to be doing in this week is doing policy briefs. You're going to be organized into teams, and you'll be presenting briefs on your own particular problems. We do the same thing in our class. And in honor of General Marshall, we call these Marshall briefs because we see him as an exemplar of this strategy of seeking leverage. Finally, one other point relating to grand strategy. And this says, think of it as an ecological discipline. Think of it as a discipline in which everything is related to everything else. You may well think, and certainly many universities train you to think, in compartmentalized terms. Universities are even organized in compartmentalized terms. They are called departments: Department of History, Department of Political Science, Department of Economics. I think there is too little effort within universities to think about pulling these things together, producing students who are able to cross these disciplines, to think about how they interconnect with one another, to think about the world as a whole. And that, I would say, is a huge problem today. We understand the need to do this clearly enough when we're talking about the global ecology, when we're talking about something like global warming. We can see these interconnections operating. We can document them. We can calculate them. But how many people thought ecologically in the run-up to the financial bust of last year? How many people who were in charge of this country's economy and several other countries' economies were thinking ecologically when they mindlessly put zillions of dollars into subprime mortgages? Had they thought about why mortgages of that kind are called subprime in the first place? Had they thought about the history of previous financial booms and busts going all the way back to the Dutch tulip crisis of 1637? Had they thought about human nature and the tendency of human beings to overstretch, the tendency of speculators to let hope run away from reality? Had they thought in these terms? No. They were simply operating on the basis of complicated mathematical models that even those guys did not understand. They had become so complicated. That's an example of parochial thinking. That is not an example of ecological thinking. And that's what we are trying to avoid in our class. So, timeless but timely. That's what grand strategy is. Now, I would just conclude with this question. Where have you heard this kind of thing before? Where have you heard things like, well, you shouldn't do too much of this, but you shouldn't do too much of that either? Where have you heard this thing about how you really have to kind of balance these things? Where have you heard this stuff about you have to listen to us, but we can't exactly tell you what to do when you grow up? Where have you heard that before? Okay. Parents, right? Teachers, right? Coaches, particularly. Think about what a coach does in any realm of athletics. A coach trains a young person by exposing them to the lore and the history and the rules of the game. And then by practice, incessant practice, so that they go out and play the game and build stamina and build knowledge. And part of that knowledge in any game is the ability to see all of the playing field at once. In other words, an ecological perspective. If you're just looking at your foot, you're not going to be a very good football player. Okay. And then, what does a coach do when the game starts? The coach says, "Kid, you're on your own. You have to go out and play this game. I cannot speak into some earphone and tell you where to put your foot at every stage. You have to have an instinct for this yourself. You don't consult some complicated computer model. You don't listen to old grizzled football players telling you how it was back in 1942 or whatever. You have to go out and do it yourself, and that's the bottom line on grand strategy. That's what you are going to have to face. That's what our students are going to have to face, and that is the connection. Now, just one other thought that I would like to leave you with. Where does medicine fit in to all of this? What is medicine, anyway? At one level, it is certainly the accumulation of wisdom over a period of time that goes back about as far as we take grand strategy. The Hippocratic Oath and what lies behind that comes from the same period, really, where we start the study of the grand strategy class. The accumulated wisdom of how to treat illness, but at the same time the modification of that wisdom in the light of new technologies that have come along. The training that a young doctor or a healthcare professional gets, it seems to me reflects or is very similar to what I'm talking about here, because it would be important for you to have a sense of that accumulated body of wisdom out there. It certainly would be important for you to have a sense of the latest trends in research and treatment that are going on out there. All of those things are critically important. But it all comes down to the individual patient. And when you're looking at the individual patient, what are you looking at? You're looking at the history of that person, not an entire class, not an entire country. You're looking at the history of that person. And you're looking at that person as a whole, not just the lungs and not just the spleen and not just the brain, but if you're a good doctor and even if you're a specialist, you're thinking about the relationship of your specialty to that person as a whole. You're doing case histories. You're connecting the individual and the particular with the general and the theoretical. And that, ladies and gentlemen, really is what grand strategy is all about as we think about it here. Thank you so much.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Professor Gaddis yesterday afternoon was sitting in his study composing that eloquent address, I was working in my backyard, pruning my roses and attacking the weeds. The garden has now inflicted its return damage on me, and I woke up this morning with a very, very stiff right rump. And at present, I can't really tell whether it's more painful to stand than to sit. We shall see. I beg your forgiveness if I move to sit, but I think I can get this to stand.
Come to the right place.
Yeah, but there could be an excess of medical advice, which is another grand strategic principle we try to inculcate. So you've heard from Professor Gaddis about the principles of grand strategy that we try to carry out in our year-long course with undergraduates, but also with graduate and professional students. And you've heard that we start off chiefly with texts from military encounters, because they are where the original writings on grand strategy came from. To think of the war as a whole, or the campaign as a whole, or even fighting a war to make sure that the peace which follows is a peace that you would want and others would want too. So we begin, unashamedly with the military dimension of human activity, which has been a long and very sordid one, but has given us lessons. And we also try to think and teach the students to think about different levels of operation in the pursuit of a strategy. If the grand strategy is for example, what is formulated by the big people at the top. This is a photograph, well-known photograph to our students at least, of Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt meeting with their chiefs of staff, their leading Air Force, Navy, and military officers at the conference at Casablanca in January 1943, where they formulated the grand strategy for the rest of the war. That they would have to, that Germany was the prime enemy. It was just too big, too powerful technologically. Germany first, though there would be, of course, campaigning in the Pacific. There would be unconditional surrender. This would be a war to the end. There was going to be no negotiated peace. Then you had to get things done, and this is where the grand strategists turn to the people who have to get things done. The chiefs of staff go home with a set of operating instructions. You have to win the Battle of the Atlantic. You have to get command of the air over Germany. You have to figure out how to land on a hostile shore. Go and do it. It's rather like a CEO, a new CEO coming into PepsiCo or whatever and saying, here's a new set of operating procedures, here's a set of things we want to expand in the Latin American market, we want to bring in new products, now you go and fix it. So we're interested not just in those timeless principles, but we're interested through the case studies we look at how things get done or how things fail to get done. And so we come down from the grand strategic level to more to the operational level. So staying just for one more minute only at the military level, here in 1943, as Churchill and Roosevelt flew back home, the Western Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. They were losing too many merchant ships to the German U-boats. And yet somewhere in the course of 1943, a number of people figured out how better to fight the U-boats, how to run the convoys more effectively, how to put more fuel into long-range aircraft like this Liberator so you could cover the gap in the Atlantic of air coverage, how to bring newer weapons, some of them invented by very eccentric people, how to bring all of these to play. There had to be an organization under the big guys. It's no use the Minister of Health saying, we want to do this. No use the cabinet saying we want to do this if it isn't organization. And what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my remarks is a case study which is not at all a military one. It takes me back rather fondly to my years in the northeast of England, where I was taught social and economic history of the Industrial Revolution in England. And it was a social history. It was a social history of a country which was beginning to become modern. A social history of a country where millions of people were coming from the countryside into the shanty cities and towns, especially in the north of England. It was one where the poor were much more visible because there was many more of them. Between the year 1800 and 1900, in other words, in the 19th century, the population of Great Britain goes up fourfold, from 10 million to 40 million people. You have a population explosion. It's the one which so worried Reverend Thomas Malthus when he wrote about the challenge of a population explosion. How are you to deal with it? This was called increasingly, because one could see that industrialization was bringing more and more people into these gigantic cities, slum cities. How are you to deal with it? This was the so-called condition of England question. And it therefore is a sort of forerunner or predator of some of the challenges facing health and administrative officials in some of the gigantic cities of today, of Sao Paulo, of Mexico City, of Accra. how do you do it? Where do you get started? How are you going to handle this thing? And it became a pressing matter of debate among the upper classes and among the middle classes and among those who are starting to think professionally about healthcare, about improvement, about modernization, and essentially how one was going to move away from this truly awful Dickensian world of poverty in the slums. How are you going to do it? How are you going to improve housing? How are you going to, where were you going to think strategically about how to get things done? And what's more, how were you going, and this was an underlying concern, how were you going to avoid the discontents welling up in these enormous city slums being exploited by those who wanted to have a really transformative political revolution, not necessarily a social revolution? This is one of the most famous works of the time. I've used the original German title and frontispiece here, Die Lage der arbeitenden Klasse in England, written by Engels, who later on became Marx's best friend and partner. Marx, until this time, had been thinking chiefly in terms of idealistic philosophy, post-Hegelian philosophy. How do you explain change in history? What is real and what is not real? And then when he reads Engels, The Condition of the Working Class in England, he suddenly turns from being an idealistic philosopher, a Hegelian, to thinking about the real world, the material world, what he calls the substructure, the foundations, and begins to flip Hegel around and to argue it's the foundations, the material social foundations, the relations of production. Who holds the cash? Who owns the factories? Where are the workers' positions? Where are their rights? And so you get this, if you like, almost competition throughout 19th century Europe and then spreading to the US, a competition between those who thought that there could be nothing more than radical reform and a total transformation of society, getting rid of the ruling class, getting rid of the bourgeoisie, and others who thought that there was a way to go which would improve the lot of the working classes, which would be a solution in any case. And among these, as a leading contender, although he never would have thought of himself as a leading contender against Marx, there are the writings and the thoughts of this chap. Jeremy Bentham was also a philosopher of the early 19th century. He invents or puts forward the whole notion, the whole doctrine of utilitarianism. He's interested in usefulness and practicalness, in how you get things done. He defined happiness for society. Happiness was the greatest good of the greatest number. And therefore happiness could not just exist in a society for the ruling class or the aristocratic elite. He wasn't so much thinking of any fear of a communist revolution as some later thinkers and politicians were. It was, how do you achieve the greatest good for the greatest number? He was suffused with that optimism which came out of the age of the Enlightenment. He believed in the perfectibility of human beings. He was not in favor of notions of medieval notions, if you like, or pre-modern notions that man was just born with original sin. His key word, and you see it in a lot of his writings, you see it in a lot of the legislation which we call Benthamite legislation or utilitarian legislation, the favorite word was the improvement. What he was looking for was the improvement of humankind. So he had this belief that you could, by using your brains and by using certain mechanisms and structures, you could improve things. That condition of a working class which had been so bleakly described by Engels, which caused Marx to forecast that over time there would be ever greater impoverishment of the proletariat. So there would be, in Marx's view, an inevitable proletarian revolution. Bentham did not accept it at all. You could do things. You needed structures, but you start with an idea. You start with an ideology. You start with a belief in the improvability of the human condition. So essentially optimistic. A lot of utilitarian writing is excessively optimistic. A lot of it is does not assume all of the things we try to teach in grand strategy about frictions, about things going wrong. But this is pushing for improvement. It's kind of interesting when you think about it, ladies and gentlemen, because this age of the first third or first 40 years or so of the 19th century is when we recognize a whole set of reforms, as they were called. This was the age of reform. This was the age of the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire. This was the age of the abolition of not just of the slave trade, but of slavery itself. This was the age of the emancipation of Catholics, who were no longer, after 1829, forbidden to practice their faith. This is the age of getting rid of protectionism, getting rid of the Corn Laws. This is the age in which you begin to think of all other measures. You abolish flogging in the army. You abolish, as a form of capital punishment, you abolish cruel and inhumane capital punishments. No more people going to be publicly garroted in the street or something like that. So the reformers are everywhere. But you're now not talking just about abolishing things, you're talking about improving things. And you start off with the ideas of improvement. You start off with a book like this on the principles of morals and legislation. But look at that second word, legislation. You don't believe you're going to do it just by preaching from the pulpit, although there was an awful lot of pulpit preaching in early Victorian Britain. You're going to do it by the state, by legislation. And so what you get, in addition to these various acts for the abolition of the slave trade or the emancipation of the Catholics, what you begin to get from this period onwards, again, look at the date, are things called the Factory Acts. It's far too detailed for me even to interpret it here. But what they were acts, first of all, to make it illegal for the employment of children to work in the mines, down in the mines. That's the first of the Factory and Mines Act. Then it was restricting the amount of hours that could be worked so that the working classes were not working 12, 14 hours a day. There was a restricted number of hours in the week. There was safety legislation, improvement in conditions in the mines and the textile mills. There's improvements in compensation. There were arguments about, heated arguments, of course, and sometimes many of them lost by the utilitarians because they were proposing too much, perhaps too fast. And the question is, who was going to do this? Even if you passed the act, you needed to do something to enforce it, to patrol it, to ensure it, to report on it. It was all very well for certain enlightened factory owners like Owen up in New Lanark. New Lanark is just outside Edinburgh in Scotland. It's all very well for him to turn his factory into what was called a new model factory and to make it a place with good housing, with schools attendant to the factory or next to the factory for children, for improved health conditions, etc. Very paternalistic, the Owen's New Lanark system, but it He was arguing that it would be the factory owners themselves who did it. But of course, he was in a very, very small minority of factory owners who found that they wanted to invest money. They wanted to invest resources in this set of improvements. Even when Owen experimented by reducing the work day and the work week and found that he got greater worker productivity and output if your worker was not in the factory next to the machine for 14 hours a day but was having an 8-hour day, the overall output went up. Even with those sort of rational, utilitarian, Benthamite discoveries and arguments, many people resisted it. So there had to be other ways of getting this done. They had other things were also necessary. You needed to improve. If you were in a society which was growing so fast, which was so turbulent, which was so frightening, you needed something more in terms of provision of structures of security and safety in the great cities than simply calling in the Redcoats, calling in the British Army. You had to have, in addition to your social improvements, you needed structures for the security of the fabric of the society. So it's not surprising that, again, look at the date here. Not surprising, well, I didn't put the date on, I beg your pardon, but it's not surprising that in 1840, the English Parliament passes an act of legislation for the creation of the Metropolitan Police Force. This is the first civil police force in history. It isn't armed. In fact, the British police were not armed until about 25 years ago. It was paid, it was professional, it was recruited. It took the army out of society, took the army out of politics. It became the model for police forces in cities across the world. And it was providing security, but it was providing it in a kind of supportive, constructive way. You took away the image that the authorities were always repressing you or suppressing you. Police boards, civilian police boards, approved the appointment of the local inspector or commissioner. Training was insisted upon. So you're putting together a package of improvements, some of which were more to do with negative liberty, some more to do with positive liberty. Let's go on. I said, who carries this out? This must be an incredible challenge to any society which is developing fast, is encountering massive social fabric problems, healthcare problems, supervision, administration problems, just trying to get things done. I've been emphasizing throughout my talk that this is, at least as my particular interest, my particular cut in grand strategy, is who does it and how do they experiment, how do they figure things out. This is another apparently obscure act. It is an act of Parliament of 1857, which went through both houses, so it's got a double-barreled name, Lord Northcote and Trevelyan in the House of Commons. And what it did was to essentially establish the world's first permanent professional civil service. You can see that it is a report, so you get through, Betsy's very familiar with this, you start off with a working party or committee, it investigates a problem, it produces a report, the report gets discussed, it might be amended, it then goes to a further body. John Gaddis and I sit on far too many university committees where we get reports on the improvement of the syllabus of Yale College or something like that. And in this case, it goes through the Parliament and gets enacted. What did it do? It got rid of the old corruption. It got rid of baksheesh. It got rid of bribes because it established a permanent professional civil service where you could only enter after examinations. You had to take national competitive examinations to enter. You had a fixed salary scale, and it was in rung ladder ways, so seniority counted. You were no longer permitted to take any sorts of fees yourself. Customs officials who took customs fees, clerks of court who took court fees and put half of them in their back pocket. It was to be the end of that. It was to create a professional national administrative cadre which would get things done. And the training, the examination, but also the training in the first few years of the civil service was with the conviction that you could take these administrative skills, the transferability that John Gaddis was talking about. You take the transferability because you'd been taught, like, what's the problem? What's the contending theories? What's the evidence? Where do we get the data from? This is pure Benthamism. It's being driven by what's the problem? How can it be solved? How do we measure it? How do we report on it? The whole notion of modern bureaucracy spewing out vast thousands and thousands of reports and paperwork probably goes back to the Northcote Trevelyan reforms and the notion that this is a way to do it. In Bentham's view, it was scientific. It was really supposed to work. Did it? Well, not that easily. I said that Bentham and the utilitarians had this great optimism. They found that for all the advances they made, the population was increasing, the areas of slum development were increasing, they discovered over time the issue of poverty, not just in the inner cities, which was right in their face, but rural poverty, poverty in the countryside. You needed to have another commission on that. You needed to investigate what were the special problems of the countryside in the age of the agricultural depression after 1873. In 1899 to 1900, Britain gets itself involved in South Africa in the Second Boer War. There's an appeal for volunteers to come and join the British Army. In Manchester, remember Manchester of Engels, the condition of the working class in Manchester. In Manchester, out of the 12,000 young men who apply to join the British Army, to go and fight, 7,000 are turned down because of inadequate weight and height. And this is a massive shock, a further shock to the system. It's statistical evidence, and the more you do it, the more you have reports from Rowntree and Booth, Rowntree studies the condition of the poorer classes and poverty in the town of York and the city of York and Yorkshire. You're getting evidence that these are hard problems. They don't easily go away. You're getting some examples of success, and you're looking for other models of success. Is what's happening in some of the southern English cities transferable to the larger cities in the north? Can we learn from the German social legislation under Bismarck? What do we learn from German social legislation about creating pensions, about having health insurance for the first time? What do we learn? In other words, they're still Benthamite, they're still questioning, they're still going about things. But if you'd ever read, say, a couple of the writings of the English novelist of the interwar years, George Orwell, if you read his Down and Out in London and Paris, or you read in particular a book of his called, a novel of his, a sort of novel but description called The Road to Wigan Pier. Orwell goes and lives with the poor. He goes to poor houses, to working houses, to workshops. He goes hop picking. An old Etonian from the highest class. He wants to understand what's happening. And he details that there's still a way to go. So I don't want to end with any sense at all that just because you have a grand strategy up there, just because you've got Mr. Bentham with his principles of morals and legislation, just because you have a Northcote Trevelyan reforms, you get it done. You achieve what you're going to. So I'm going to end with one cartoon which comes from 1943-44 when the British government, aware that in a few years' time at least they would win the Second World War, that they were going to get out of it, began even in wartime to think of how do we deal with the challenges facing our society? How do we finally get to, if we can put all of this energy into defeating Hitler, how can we not use some of that energy after the war to defeat poverty, to defeat all of the things which seem to be getting in the way? So the Beveridge Report is yet another example of Benthamite action, which is you investigate the state of the British nation, you investigate the social fabric, you note how few of the children are getting anywhere beyond the age of 12 or 13 in their schooling, and you report on that in the hope that you're going to create a better society. And you bring it to the Parliament, and you get, after 1945, with the coming in of Clement Attlee's Labour administration, you get the beginnings of a so-called welfare state. The creation of a pension system, the creation of national health insurance, the regulations over the hospitals and the medication. You get improvements in the schools. You get the opening up of the ancient universities to ever more members of less advantaged classes. You could still go to parts of England, Scotland, Europe, and this country today and see that there was still a long, long list of things to be done. But what I'm interested in, what I leave you with, ladies and gentlemen, is the thought that yes, you can have your 5 days here at Yale, and yes, you have in many cases long studied these problems and challenges of health administration, health care. And yes, you're much more aware, much better than us, of what the priority of the challenges are. But I think that while one may start at the top, even in identifying what is the number one priority for your country's healthcare problems, the questions are, how do we get it done? And who's going to do it? And how do we report on it? And how do we get feedback? And how do we learn? And can we get a way of having people understand that you are, like the Benthamites, kind of pushing a boulder along. And it's a very heavy boulder. And sometimes it gets stuck in the mud. And then you have to think of ways of releasing it, of pushing that boulder on. And that's what professionals are for. That's what the middle managers are for. That's what the people who see the problem because they're right down there trying to implement solutions. That's what your job is. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.